Hi, my name is Andrew Roberts. I'm in ISA 4220, Server System Security, and this is the presentation on firewall services. So typically there are two types of firewalls: a hardware firewall, which is a standalone hardware device that is typically integrated with a router or sometimes a modem as well, that sits between, and this device is installed in the network, but typically between the gateway and the router. And there's also a software firewall, and these are applications that are installed on a server that will be used to filter traffic, much like a hardware firewall, but they will be installed on an operating system such as Windows with Windows Firewall or Linux with IP tables. So generally, firewalls work by creating tables of addresses and ports that are used as a reference to handle how connections are filtered when they reach the firewall itself. These are set up as rules that are either allow or deny, and they can be either specific network addresses or a range or pool of addresses. It's typically a good idea to deny all the traffic as it would come into the router. This is known as whitelisting because you generally block everything and you create a whitelist of the connections that you want to allow into the network. This is a better approach than blacklisting because blacklisting, you would have to create a huge list of the things you don't want in your network, and it's much easier just to deny everything and then open the ports in the firewall to the services that you need to connect to. If you are running a software firewall, you do want to try to minimize any other services that are running on that firewall server. If you can avoid it, you want the firewall to be fast and allow traffic to get through, and the best way to do this is to have a dedicated system that can allow the firewall to do its job and do it well. Also, since this firewall is on the edge of your network, you do not want to give it a privileged account, such as the administrator or root account. Generally speaking, if you could create a unique user account and run the firewall as that user, it's better to do this because if the firewall were to be compromised on the edge of your network, then at least they do not have access to a privileged account. Obviously, you would want to change the default password on the firewall if it is a hardware firewall. These hardware firewall units typically come with a default password installed, and this is only so that you can log in and change the configuration. It is absolutely necessary that this password be changed immediately upon installation of the firewall unit. It's also a good idea to disable any ports that are in line with any known vulnerabilities. There's typically lists of common attack vectors such that might show up on your router. You do want to avoid any ports that have been known to cause issues. Although this does not imply that security through obscurity is an option, this idea will only slow down an attacker. It does not necessarily mitigate the vulnerability. You do, of course, want to limit physical access to the firewall. Obviously, a firewall is capable of protecting an internal network from the outside world. However, if an attacker were to get physical access to the firewall, then they could essentially easily manipulate the computer or the software or the hardware device such that as setting a factory reset or just accessing the configuration files directly. So it is very important to limit physical access to the firewall. You also want to keep the configuration as simple as possible. If you find that there are 100 rules listing all the internal IP ranges addresses, you might want to consider using an IP range or a subnet mask. If you also want to make sure that when you do install a software firewall, that this is on a server that is routinely secured and patched on a regular basis. Even with a hardware firewall, you must make sure that the hardware firmware on that firewall is being updated regularly. If there are any known vulnerabilities that have been listed from the vendor, then you need to make sure that these vulnerabilities get addressed and get patched as soon as possible. When running a firewall, it is also very important to enable firewall logging and any alert services that will allow you to be notified if there were an event that would be of interest. You can set many firewalls to set up red flags on certain error events or access events if they are outside of a firewall rule, or if there may be just an unknown connection from an IP that is not typically accessing the network. It is also a good idea to use a separate remote server that is used to remotely store these log files. That way, the log files that are being generated on the firewall itself may be subject to manipulation if an attacker was trying to cover their tracks. However, if those logs are immediately transferred to a remote location and stored elsewhere, then you would at least have a backup copy of those logs to go through, and you could at least verify that the logs have not been tampered with. You need to maintain firewall logs as if they were business records. You can almost treat firewall logs as if they were some, so to speak, financial records, like as if they were transactions of very important money transactions. Every transaction on the firewall could be important to establishing who was making the connection, or if it was malicious intent from an outside attacker, or if it was somebody within the company. It's all very important information if an event were to occur. These logs need to be backed up periodically and held onto as long as possible, or according to the company's retention policies. There needs to be change management procedures in place that verify that any change that's made to the firewall configuration has obtained its prior approval and was allowed to be changed, and then there is also an important level of accountability of who made that change, when the change was made, and also backups need to be taken both before and after these changes were set to the server or hardware device. Firewalls need to be routinely tested. A quarterly vulnerability assessment would be useful to ensure that the rules are configured properly and that there are no recent vulnerabilities that would allow outside access to the firewall or unauthorized access. Audits should be performed at least once a year to see how the policies are matching up to the actual security of the firewall. Many companies will have policies in place stating what should be done, but there needs to be an auditing period where it is held accountable to see if what should be happening is what is actually happening. The firewall also needs to consistently monitor the vendor's website to be aware of any security bulletins or changes that have been sent, such as any known vulnerabilities or any firmware updates or software updates that are being sent out to patch software firewall. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.